All right, Kingwood students and parents, thanks for joining me and tuning in again. This is week 2 on A Practical Guide to Culture. We started it last week, and we're just going to jump right back into it. Today should be a lot shorter than last week, but we'll tell you what we covered in class on Sunday, as well as hopefully give you a few questions and ideas to start some conversations at home. So we ended this past week talking about worldview, talking about the lens through which we see the world. And that's the whole idea of this study on culture, is to identify all those areas, all those things that influence the way that we see the world, that influence our worldview. Specifically, whenever it comes to being a Christian, we want to know, what are the things that are affecting the way that I see the world? What are the things that are affecting the way that I live? And my life. And so as we talked about this idea of culture, we started talking about what culture is and what culture is made up of. And here are the things that we said. We said that culture is dynamic, that culture changes. It's not the same very long. One of our students talked about the crate challenge. And if you haven't seen that, it's a bunch of crates stacked up high. And the idea is to run across the top of them. It starts and builds kind of like a pyramid and goes back down. And all sorts of people on social media right now are doing the crate challenge. But guess what? It's not going to last very long. It's going to be popular for a while. And some trends last for a good little while. But it's going to change. It's going to become different. Something else will take the place of the crate challenge. It will just be a matter of time. So it's dynamic. It's not static. It's also made up of smaller subcultures, meaning you've got your culture at large, and then you've got all of these other smaller categories of things that make up different parts of the culture and different little subcultures within the bigger culture as a whole. And then we talked about how it's made up of ideas, of how our culture does a great job of giving us different ideas and making us try to believe that those are true, that those are truth. And sometimes they're good ideas. The ideas aren't always bad, but sometimes they're ideas that would be different from what God would want for us. One of those biggest things of the ideas that we talked about was the idea of you do you and I'll do me. Meaning there's a different standard for every person. Every single one of us has a different kind of moral compass, a different way to live, and a different standard of which to live by. That's what the culture tells us. Culture says, you can do whatever you want and I'll do whatever I want. There's not one universal moral standard or moral compass for all of us to live by. So our culture says what may be right for you may be wrong for me, etc. And again, that's just not something that's from God. That's not an idea that is a godly idea, because our moral standard, our moral compass isn't something worldly. It's not something that's made up by what we want or what we would like, but our moral compass should be made up of what does God like? What does God want for our lives? What does God say about all of these issues that we're going to be talking about over the upcoming months? So our culture is made up of ideas. It's spread through champions, meaning there are different people, influencers, that help to spread those ideas throughout our lives. Maybe it's social media influencers, maybe it's teachers, maybe it's coaches, maybe it's a youth minister. Champions are just the people that are helping spread the culture. And generally, the champions are, when we're saying that, we're meaning people that are influencing the culture at large. So you might have some different people, like the youth minister might influence your culture, might be a champion for you, but really the idea is, who are the bigger at large people that are helping to influence the culture and the world around us? So it's spread through champions. It's communicated through artifacts. It's communicated through artifacts, which are just all of the ways that our culture is spread, whether it's social media, whether it's sports, whether it's video games, whether it's whatever it is. The artifacts are the way that our culture is communicated, all of the different things that make up our culture. And it's maintained by institutions, meaning that there are schools, churches, larger organizations as a whole that help to maintain all of those cultural things and kind of lay the standard for that. So then we got into chapter 2. That was the end of chapter 1. And then we started talking about not confusing the moment and the story. We talked about how as Christians, we are part of a larger story of God, how we're part of a larger story, not just one. We might live in one moment, but that moment is a part of a larger story that we play in. For us as Christians, we believe that. We believe that while we might live during this time, God is having a larger story at play in the world and through around us. So it's the idea of the larger story is that God is using his people. He used the Israelites, now he uses Christians, but God is using his people to lead nations out of poverty, to create brilliant art, to tell life-changing stories, to adopt orphans, to heal sick, to restore broken lives and cultures. God wants us to be a part of his story. God wants to use us in our culture today to help make a difference, to do all of these things that are from him in the world around us. So on top of that, God equips us. God doesn't just want us to be a part of that larger story. God wants to show us how. God wants to equip us to make a difference in our cultural moment and in every time and situation that he puts us in. And the idea of this is that the Bible isn't just true for one culture, but it's true for all, whether we believe it or not. That there's a higher standard, that God is the one, that the Bible wasn't just for the Israelites. It wasn't just for people thousands of years ago. But the Bible still reveals things to us today, still shows us how to live, still speaks into every moment and every situation that we might face even today. So the Bible isn't true for just one culture, it's true for all, whether we believe it or not. It's also important to remember that its full meaning is only revealed in light of that larger story. That we're a part of this larger story that God is using and that's at play. That story where there was creation, where Adam and Eve were made first, but we too are created. Then there's fall. Adam and Eve fell. Adam and Eve sinned. We too fall. We too sin and are imperfect. But then there's the story of redemption that started with the covenant relationship with the Israelites and is fulfilled through Jesus Christ and what he's done for us. And so God has redeemed his chosen people. And now we, all people, can be God's chosen people and can be redeemed, which leads to that last thing, that's restoration, that is showing that full idea of things being made new. Us being made new through Jesus and the world being made through us and the influence that we have on it. And so as we talked about this idea of culture, we talked about how a lot of times as Christians, we ask the question, where should I draw the line? Like, what's okay for me to do in culture and what's not? What things are okay for me to be a part of, this or that, but not this, not that. And so oftentimes we ask the question, where should I draw the line? At what point is God going to get mad at me for being a part of culture? And when we're asking that question, it's totally the wrong question. And the book talks about how everything that's worldly is bad. That's what you assume when you ask that question, is that, okay, if I'm going to be a Christian, I have to be a part of only spiritual things, not worldly things, which leads you to the conclusion that anything in the world is bad and that everything spiritual is good. And that's not always the case. There can be worldly things that can be good, that can be beneficial. There can also be spiritual things that we're taught and led to believe that are not true and are not from God, that our society is telling us. And so we need to be aware of what those are. So instead of us asking that question, we should instead ask the question, what is our salvation for? And that's what we'll talk more about next week. We'll talk more about what is our salvation for. And instead of us just dwelling on the fact of, like, how can I be involved in culture but not be like I want to be in the world, but not of the world. So where's the line I should draw? Instead, we ask, what is our salvation for? And we think about being a part of that larger story, and we think about the redemption and us redeeming the world around us. So Jesus makes us perfect and makes us right, not just to live holy lives, although he certainly wants us to live holy, set apart lives from the world around us. But he wants us to use that to go into the world, to share the good news with others, to share the gospel message of Jesus. And so that's the question that maybe we should ask instead. Instead of where is the line that I draw in culture, the question should be, how can God use me in culture? What is my salvation for? How can I now make an influence in those around me and in the world around me to help others see Jesus and to know God through my life? So that's kind of the quick overview of the rest of chapter 1 and chapter 2. We'll probably cover a couple of chapters. There's a little bit more introduction stuff, but most of that kind of goes together and ties in with things that we've already talked about. And so really soon we'll be getting into a lot of specific issues and talking about, what does God say? How does God speak into each one of these moments and one of these times? So thanks for joining us again this week. That was our summary for A Practical Guide to Culture. This is, I guess, lesson 2, which was the end of chapter 1. And we covered and kind of hit the highlights on chapter 2. So thanks for joining. Hope that you have a great week, and we will see you again next week. Bye, guys.